plantation could not penetrate. The priest was effectively building an alternate governance, operating within an empire, invisible because it respected no paperwork, no oversee, no signature. And make no mistake, the masters would have destroyed him instantly had they known. Slavery thrived on predictability, on fear as a controlling mechanism. The priest weaponized the human instinct they sought to suppress: love, loyalty, identity, turning it into quiet rebellion. They could punish a man's body. They could not punish what lived in memory, what lived in hearts, what lived in vows made in darkness. And this is why what he did was dangerous beyond comprehension. Not because it toppled armies in the open, but because it transformed the very matrix of obedience. It demonstrates a principle institutions fear most, that authority is only legitimate if it is accepted. Take acceptance away, or redirect it, and the empire begins to erode. By now, you should feel a shift. This is not history you can observe safely. It's a blueprint, a lesson, something dangerous if you carry it wrong, but lethal if you carry it right. If you are listening and understanding, repeat to yourself, I am no longer invisible to my own loyalty. I choose what I serve. And keep that thought ready. We are only going deeper. The priest did not act alone. That would have been suicide. He had allies, quiet, careful, invisible, but true allies, who understood that survival depended on discretion. These were people who could speak a word, not a gesture, or carry a message without drawing attention. Together, they formed what could be described only as a covert council, an underground network of recognition and trust. Every step he took was calculated. Every word spoken in ritual was a vector for psychological freedom. He knew that humans internalize authority differently when it is framed as sacred. To the couple kneeling before him, he represented something larger than themselves, larger than their masters. They were participating in a covenant that transcended ownership. That knowledge, silent, sacred, secret, was more binding than chains ever could be. And what's remarkable is that it worked on multiple levels. The enslaved gained a moral hierarchy inside themselves. Their loyalty to the priest's authority overrode fear of the master's punishment. Obedience was no longer absolute. It became negotiable. That subtle shift is what systems fear most, when individuals start calculating their own value, their own loyalties, their own sacred lines of obedience. The masters, of course, thought they controlled everything. They measured work in bushels of cotton, in labor hours, in broken spirits. They assumed resistance had to be visible. They never considered that power could exist quietly, woven into rituals, hidden in promises that left no trace but in memory. And memory is bulletproof. Memory survives fire, ledger destruction, auction block, and death. By the end of a decade, the priest had married hundreds of people whose identities had been denied, whose agency had been stripped, were now bound together by something that could not be bought, sold, or broken. This was not rebellion that could be shouted in the street. It was rebellion embedded in hearts, in minds, in families. It was imperceptible to anyone who lacked insight into human psychology. And this is where it becomes profound and terrifying. The priest showed that systems of absolute control can be undermined not by force, but by sacred loyalty. He weaponized ceremony, ritual, and secrecy. He taught a generation to recognize authority outside the system that sought to own them. And by doing so, he created a moral underground, a quiet, invisible power that no whip, no auction, no law could ever fully extinguish. By now, you should understand why this knowledge feels dangerous. Because once you see how invisible networks of loyalty and power can function, you cannot unsee it. You start noticing structures you were told were absolute, and you begin questioning them. If you are ready to anchor this, comment twice in the thread below. I see what they cannot control. I see what they cannot control. This is not ritual, it is activation. And if you've done that, lean in. Because the next layer, the psychological mastery, the hidden codes, the system within the system, is far darker. What the priest truly understood, what made him lethal to the system, was not theology. It was behavioral architecture. He knew that humans do not live by rules, they live by meaning. And whoever controls meaning controls action long before action is visible. The masters believed law was the highest authority. The priest knew law as only a script people agree to perform. So he introduced a counterscript. Every secret marriage carried embedded instructions, not spoken openly, never written, but transmitted through tone, repetition, and symbolism. The vow was not just between man and woman. It was a declaration of permanence in a world designed to make everything temporary. Temporary labor, temporary family, temporary identity. Permanence is destabilizing to systems that depend on disposability. He taught them to remember dates, not birthdays the system refused to record, but nights of commitment. He taught them to mark time by relationships rather than seasons of harvest. This quietly rewired how people experienced reality. When time is measured differently, obedience fractures. You stop living inside the master's clock. The priest also understood hierarchy. He never positioned himself as a revolutionary leader. That would have been noticed. Instead, he positioned himself as a steward, someone who existed to confirm bonds, not command behavior. That made him untouchable in the minds of those he served. You can replace a leader. You cannot replace a witness. And the ceremonies themselves were psychologically precise. Kneeling created humility without submission. Touch created grounding. Call and response synchronized nervous systems. Silence before the vow elevated anticipation. These are techniques still used today in military conditioning, cult formation, and elite initiation rites. The priest didn't invent them. He inherited them. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The same psychological mechanics used to control masses can be inverted to free individuals. That is what makes this knowledge dangerous. The plantation system relied on fragmentation. Different owners, different rules, different punishments. No continuity. The priest created continuity where none was supposed to exist. Families began recognizing each other across plantations. Networks formed. Information moved faster, not through meetings, but through kinship. Who was cruel? Who was predictable? Where danger moved? Where safety briefly existed? The masters mistook calm for compliance. But calm had become calculation. This is where institutions fail again and again. They monitor behavior, not belief. They punish action, not identity. By the time identity shifts, the outcome is already determined. And now you should feel it clearly. This is not about a priest in chains. This is about how power actually works, and how easily it can be misdirected, once you see the seams. The priest's brilliance lay in his patience. He understood that transformation is incremental. One vow does not topple an empire. 10 vows barely scratch the surface. Hundreds. Generational change begins. He operated in what I call the shadows of influence. Small gestures repeated until they shaped the inner world. The masters never noticed because they looked for spectacle, for outrage, for revolt. They never studied the architecture of loyalty, the invisible scaffolding of human allegiance. He taught people to feel ownership over their own lives in the smallest ways. A shared glance, a whispered instruction, a remembered promise. These became acts of defiance so subtle they were invisible. And yet, when multiplied across hundreds of people, across decades, these small acts created a network that could not be dismantled. Chains could not break what existed in memory, in the nervous system, in hearts committed to each other. Imagine the audacity of it. A man with no rights, no freedom, no weapon, quietly rewriting the rules of authority under the very eyes of those who believed they owned everything. Every master assumed they understood the dynamics of obedience because they controlled the visible tools of compliance. But they overlooked the internal mechanisms, the heart, the mind, the sacred trust that cannot be catalogued in ledgers. This priest weaponized the human spirit itself. And here's the lesson most overlook. Systems rely on the illusion of total dominion. They do not account for invisible networks of trust and loyalty, because those networks cannot be legislated, measured, or punished. They only exist until someone notices them. And notice is dangerous. He knew the line between survival and execution. That is why every act was ritualized, coded, almost theatrical in its subtlety. One misstep and discovery meant death. Yet he thrived. Because he understood psychology far beyond the comprehension of his captors. He knew that people obey systems, but they follow meaning. And by giving them meaning they could claim for themselves, he gave them a shield no whip could penetrate. By the time his influence was fully spread, families moved together, aligned quietly, and recognized each other in ways the system could not erase. Marriages, children, networks, moral allegiance, all invisible to anyone outside the circle, but unshakable to those inside. It was not rebellion in the streets. It was revolution in the soul. And if you are listening closely, you will realize this is not ancient history. The same principles are operating around you today. Institutions, corporations, governments all rely on assumed control, but they are blind to invisible allegiances, unspoken vows, networks of trust that cannot be legislated. This is the doorway you have entered. The first lesson: power flows where loyalty actually resides. And the masters never, ever understood that. Lean in. The next section will take us into the dark science behind this invisible authority. The methods, the patterns, the code of influence that turns fear into obedience and obedience into vulnerability. To understand how the priest remained undetected, you have to understand how institutions see the world. They see roles, not people. Functions, not intentions. A worker, a preacher, a body, a number. Systems survive by reducing humans to predictable categories, because prediction is control. The priest exploited that blindness with surgical precision. To the masters, he was a religious utility, someone who calmed unrest, who spoke about patience, who wrapped suffering in scripture. They believed religion weakened resistance. And most of the time, they were right. But they misunderstood one critical variable. Religion is not obedience. It is allegiance. And allegiance can be redirected without ever changing the words. The priest never contradicted doctrine openly. That would have raised alarms. Instead, he reweighted it. He emphasized covenant over commandment, witness over punishment, responsibility over submission. These shifts are invisible to anyone who hears only surface language. But to those listening from inside suffering, the meaning was unmistakable. He understood something most controllers never do. People don't rebel against authority when they are angry. They rebel when they develop an alternative source of legitimacy. The priest became that source, not by claiming power, but by affirming it in others. Every secret marriage created a psychological upgrade. Two people stopped seeing themselves as isolated units and started seeing themselves as a protected structure. That changes how risk is assessed, how fear is processed, how pain is endured. Fear loses efficiency when it is shared. Punishment loses power when it is interpreted through loyalty rather than shame. And here's the part you're supposed to overlook in history books. This kind of influence doesn't disappear when the man dies. The priest was not building dependence on himself. He was building a replicable pattern. Others learned the rituals. Others learned the language. Others learned how to perform authority invisibly. The system never noticed because succession didn't look like promotion. It looked like memory. This is how shadow institutions survive. Not through hierarchy, but through transmission. No headquarters. No manifestos. No flags. Just repeatable psychological structures embedded in daily life. And once embedded, they are almost impossible to remove. Masters came and went. Laws shifted. Patrols changed. But the internal authority remained. Families carried it. Children absorbed it. Even when separated, even when sold, the internal map persisted. A sense of who you were, who you belonged to, and what lines you would not cross, even under threat. This is the truth that should unsettle you. The most effective power systems are not enforced. They are internalized. The priest didn't fight the system head-on. He let it rot from the inside by starving it of the one thing it needed most, unquestioned psychological obedience. And once you see that mechanism, you start noticing it everywhere. We are still descending. Now, let's go deeper. What the priest accomplished was not mere rebellion. It was the creation of an internal sovereign space inside every individual he touched. Think carefully about that. A space where obedience to masters, fear of punishment, even the laws of the land was secondary to something sacred, the covenant he engineered. It was invisible, unrecorded, untouchable, and in that invisibility lay its power. He understood that control is always psychological first. Chains break bones, but beliefs break spirits. If you can shift the framework through which someone evaluates loyalty, fear, and risk, you can change their behavior without a single confrontation. That's the essence of elite influence. Subtle, invisible, relentless. And it's exactly what he did. Every ceremony was designed as an induction into a parallel hierarchy. One person acknowledges another as sacred. Authority flows differently when it is earned in secrecy rather than demanded publicly. The priest couples began to operate according to rules the masters could not see, could not punish, could not erase. And the beauty of it is that those rules were more binding than any legal code, because they were internalized. You need to understand this fully. This is not metaphor. It is human psychology weaponized. The human mind is programmable, not just by oppression, but by meaning. The priest did not need armies. He did not need swords. He programmed loyalty, courage, and shared commitment into a network of invisible nodes. The plantation was unaware, but a moral revolution was spreading quietly, neuron by neuron, family by family. And here's the lesson no history book will teach you. Systems fail not when they are attacked, but when they are ignored. When loyalty flows elsewhere. When obedience is internalized toward another source. That is why the priest survived and thrived, despite being property. Because he redirected allegiance to a higher code that the masters could not comprehend. And now, if you are truly following this, you need to act. Write it down. Speak it twice to yourself or in the comments below. I am the witness, not the owned. I am the witness, not the owned. This is symbolic, but it locks in the mental shift. Recognition is power. Claiming it activates awareness. The next layer is darker. It is where we examine how invisible authority can infiltrate entire institutions, how the psychology of allegiance can be transferred, multiplied, and weaponized without anyone noticing. This is where you begin to see the world as the priest saw it, not as a series of rules, but as a system of vulnerabilities, and where control truly resides. Lean closer, because once you understand this layer, you cannot return to naive observation. You begin to see hidden networks in your own life, in your own institutions, in the people you trust, and the responsibility becomes yours. There is a reason institutions fear informal authority more than open rebellion. Rebellion can be crushed. Informal authority spreads. It mutates. It adapts. And the priest understood that once allegiance is internalized, it no longer requires permission to operate. This is where his work crossed from survival into something far more subversive. He began to influence dispute resolution. Quietly. When conflict arose between families, people stopped appealing to overseers. They sought internal judgment. Elders, witnesses, those who had stood in the circle of vows. This is critical. When a population stops recognizing the system as the final arbiter of right and wrong, the system has already lost, even if it still appears intact. The masters never noticed because productivity didn't collapse. Fields were worked. Orders followed. Punishments still landed. But beneath that surface compliance, legitimacy had shifted. Obedience was no longer moral. It was tactical, temporary, conditional. That distinction changes everything. A man who obeys because he believes in the authority is owned. A man who obeys because he is calculating is dangerous. The priest taught calculation without ever naming it. He spoke of patience, wisdom, timing. He framed endurance as strategy, not submission. That reframing is lethal to systems built on fear, because fear only works when it is interpreted as final. This is where the invisible nation truly formed. Not a nation of land or borders, but a nation of judgment, of values, of internal law. The people began to know, deep down, what was right regardless of what was enforced. That knowledge cannot be whipped out of someone. And here's the suppressed truth. Once internal law exists, resistance becomes inevitable. Not necessarily violent, not immediate, but inevitable. Because internal law demands alignment, and misalignment creates pressure. You're not supposed to learn this. Because if men understand that legitimacy is portable, that it can be relocated from institutions to internal codes, entire control structures lose their leverage. This is not ancient wisdom. It is evergreen. And it is why the priest story was never fully told. We are not yet at the darkest layer. Now, we enter the realm where fear itself is weaponized, but turned against the system. The priest understood that fear is most effective when it is generalized, diffuse, and anonymous. Masters relied on fear of punishment, but he cultivated a different kind of fear, loyalty's fear. The fear that if one betrayed the covenant, even accidentally, they would be accountable not to a master, but to their own moral architecture. That fear is invisible. It cannot be legislated. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be threatened externally. He laid it meticulously. Every vow contained implicit consequences. Not legal consequences, but spiritual and social ones. Broken promises eroded standing in the secret network. Betrayal weakened the invisible moral hierarchy. People began to self-regulate in ways that mirrored the discipline of institutions. but for a system that could not be policed. In effect, he weaponized conscience. The psychological control systems the priest created were astonishingly sophisticated. He taught people to respect authority, but the authority was portable, decentralized, internal. A couple could leave one plantation and still be accountable to the same invisible law. Children grew knowing that morality existed beyond coercion. The system could never erase it because it had become self-reinforcing. This is why historians call him invisible. No records, no letters, no diary survived that explicitly documented hundreds of marriages. Only memory, oral tradition, and the subtle patterns left in families persisted. But those patterns were powerful. They created cohesion in a world designed to prevent it. And here's the truth that should chill you. This pattern is replicable. Anywhere. Anytime. Institutions can be undermined quietly by understanding human allegiance, ritual, and internalized legitimacy. The priest did not need armies or weapons. He needed only insight and discipline, and a system that underestimated human capacity. By now, you must realize the real lesson. The visible chains of control are never the point. It is the invisible networks, the psychological structures, the loyalty, and the allegiance that actually dictate obedience. And when those are redirected, the empire becomes fragile, even from within. Keep that in mind as we descend further. Next, we will explore how secrecy itself becomes armor, and how the priest's methods reveal a hidden architecture of power that the system never saw coming. You are learning the rules of a game few understand, and even fewer survive with awareness. Secrecy was not just protection. It was amplification. The priest understood that what is hidden gains gravity. When something must be protected, it is valued more. When a truth is whispered instead of broadcast, it embeds itself deeper in the mind. Public doctrine fades. Secret knowledge anchors identity. The ceremonies were never spoken of openly, not because people were ashamed, but because silence itself became part of the bond. Silence trained discipline. It separated insiders from outsiders. It created a psychological perimeter the masters could not cross. Even under interrogation, even under punishment, there was nothing concrete to reveal. No papers, no dates, no lists, just memory, and memory cannot be confiscated. This is where secrecy becomes armor. The priest taught them how to compartmentalize. What you show, what you say, what you carry internally. He taught them to live double lives, not in deception, but in strategic awareness. To survive under domination, you must never let the system know who you really are. That lesson alone outlives empires. Masters mistook silence for emptiness. They believed if something wasn't spoken, it didn't exist. But silence was where the real structure lived. In pauses, in glances, in who stood next to whom during punishment, in who shared food when no one was watching. Secrecy also prevented corruption. There was no visible hierarchy to climb, no titles to fight over, no positions to seize. Power circulated, but it did not crystallize. That made it resilient. Institutions rot when ambition becomes visible. The priest engineered a system where ambition had nowhere to attach. And here's the darker layer most never consider. Secrecy changes how the brain processes loyalty. When something is secret, betrayal feels existential. Not because of punishment, but because exposure would destroy meaning itself. People protected the network instinctively, the way a body protects a vital organ without conscious thought. This is why the system never found him. Not because they didn't look, but because they didn't know what to look for. They searched for leaders, messages, meetings, weapons. What they never searched for was internal coherence, shared meaning, a distributed moral code. That blindness still exists today. Institutions scan for threats that look familiar. They miss threats that operate at the level of identity. The priest did not challenge the system's force. He made its force irrelevant by shifting where allegiance lived. And once allegiance moves, power follows. You're no longer just hearing a story. You're being shown the skeleton key to domination and liberation alike. The same principles that freed these people have been used, invaded, to enslave millions since. And in the next descent, we confront that inversion, how institutions learned from this exact threat and adapted. This is where the story turns uncomfortable, because the system did not remain ignorant forever. Institutions always study their near failures. They learn not from collapse, but from almost losing control. And what the priest created sent a signal through history that power took very seriously. The lesson the system learned was simple and terrifying. If allegiance can exist outside official authority, then allegiance itself must be captured. After this era, religion was no longer merely tolerated, it was regulated. Marriage was no longer ignored, it was documented. Community was no longer informal, it was surveilled. What the priest did forced institutions to adapt, to absorb, to institutionalize the very mechanisms that had nearly escaped them. This is the pattern no one explains to you. First, power ignores what it doesn't understand. Then, it studies what threatens it. Finally, it absorbs and weaponizes it. The priest used ritual to free. The institution learned to use ritual to bind. Ceremonies became official. Clergy became licensed. Records became mandatory. What was once invisible became monitored. What was once sacred became administrative. Not to elevate people, but to track them. Marriage licenses didn't just protect families. They made families legible. Registries didn't just preserve history. They made lineage traceable. Once bonds were visible, they could be leveraged, taxed, separated, controlled. This is the inversion. The system learned that controlling bodies was inefficient. Controlling identity was permanent. And this is where modern psychological control was born, not in war rooms, but in ledgers, registries, and rituals stamped with approval. The priest showed that meaning was power. The institution responded by monopolizing meaning. From that point forward, anything that created deep loyalty, religion, marriage, nationality, profession, was brought under institutional oversight, not to save people, but to ensure no parallel allegiance could ever form again without permission. And here's the part you were never meant to connect. Every time you are told a bond doesn't count unless it is recognized by an authority, you are seeing the echo of this fear. The fear of invisible loyalty. The priest built allegiance without permission. That was his crime. That was his genius. And that is why his story survives only in fragments, in whispers, in suppressed memory. Because if men understood that allegiance can be generated without approval, entire systems would lose their leverage overnight. We are now past history. We are in the architecture of the present. And the descent continues. Now, we examine a truth few dare to confront. Power is not held by laws, armies, or titles. Power is held by what people believe is legitimate. The priest understood this centuries ago. The masters thought control was in chains and whips, in property and punishment. They never realized control is rooted in the human mind. Once belief shifts, the strongest institutions crumble quietly, invisibly, without fire or bloodshed. Think about it. When someone obeys because they feel obligated, they can be commanded. When someone obeys because they believe, allegiance becomes self-sustaining. It requires no enforcement. That is the principle the priest weaponized. Every vow he oversaw was a microcosm of this power. It bypassed the physical hierarchy and rewired the internal one. And here's the critical detail. The priest understood redundancy. He did not rely on one individual to carry the network. Each marriage was a node, each family a cluster, each child a transmission point. Even if one person faltered, the system persisted. It was distributed, resilient, and invisible. A classic principle of systems engineering, but applied to human loyalty in a society designed to erase it. The masters, naturally, never noticed because they could only measure obedience externally. Productivity was high. Noise was low. Fear was intact. Yet, internally, a new structure had taken root, a parallel authority that demanded respect, cultivated courage, and generated loyalty independent of oversight. This is why secrecy mattered so profoundly. Systems cannot suppress what they cannot perceive. The priest's marriages were never registered. No public announcement, no ledger, no witness recognized by authority. Yet each vow was more binding than any law because it operated inside the nervous system. It was internalized. It was sacred. It could not be confiscated. And this is the part that applies to every man listening right now. Systems fear internal authority more than rebellion because rebellion can be crushed, but internal authority cannot. It cannot be threatened. It cannot be struck down with force. It exists quietly, resiliently, permanently, until it spreads, multiplies, and overtakes. If you've been following this closely, you are starting to feel the pattern. This is not just history. This is an operative map of human influence. how belief can be redirected, loyalty can be internalized, and obedience can be subverted without a single confrontation. Lean in. The next layer will show the psychological techniques the priest used to make vows not just binding, but transformative, how he engineered courage, loyalty, and moral independence simultaneously. And once you understand this, you will see why real power is almost never visible. The priest's true mastery was in transformation, not ceremony. He didn't just unite people, he rewired them. Every vow was a training ground for psychological independence. Kneeling before him, a man learned to respect law without depending on it. A woman learned to endure without surrendering her agency. Children learned identity before permission was granted. And that is the essence of invisible power, shaping minds before the system even realizes it exists. He used ritual as a psychological vector. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. Repetition embeds meaning. Symbolism attaches emotion to memory. Silence amplifies anticipation. Touch grounds perception. Every marriage was engineered with this precision, not haphazardly. It was a blueprint for internalized authority, for loyalty that could not be coerced, only chosen. Notice this: obedience imposed from outside is brittle. Obedience cultivated from within is unbreakable. This distinction is what the masters never understood. They thought discipline was a function of faith. The priest proved it is a function of internal hierarchy. By creating a moral structure inside people, he allowed them to operate in the world without submission, even under extreme duress. And here's where it gets darker. He also understood the power of narrative. Every marriage was framed not just as union, but as continuity. Families were stories. Lineage was memory. He embedded identity and purpose within invisible frameworks that survived death, separation, and sale. Once identity is coded in this way, no law can erase it, no auction can dissolve it, no whip can dismantle it. The network of marriages became more than relational. It became a psychological firewall. Shared vows reinforced courage. Mutual responsibility reinforced strategy. Internalized loyalty reinforced calculation. Fear no longer dictated action. Strategy did. The oppressed became invisible operators in a system designed to make them powerless. Think about this as a principle. Real mastery of humans is subtle, internal, and relational. It's not domination. It's influence. And it's exponential. One man, by understanding human allegiance, created a network that functioned like a shadow institution, completely undetectable, entirely resilient, and morally authoritative without ever claiming conventional power. This is why his story is dangerous knowledge. Because once you understand this mechanism, you see how control operates around you, and you begin recognizing where real authority actually lives, and who holds it, often invisibly. Next, we descend into the most psychologically complex layer: how he calibrated faith, loyalty, and obedience simultaneously, creating a system that was self-policing, generational, and nearly untouchable. This is the core of forbidden mastery. The priest's genius was not in rebellion, it was in calibration. He balanced faith, loyalty, and obedience so precisely that the people he served were neither reckless nor subjugated. They were disciplined, strategic, and internally sovereign. Each marriage acted as a microcosm of this system. Fear existed, but it was directed inward, not toward the overseer. Loyalty existed, but it was portable, not granted. Obedience existed, but it was selective, not blind. This is a principle the masters never understood. Obedience is only effective when it appears voluntary. And that is why the priest's network persisted for generations. People did not follow him. They followed themselves through the lens he created. He engineered the conditions under which internal authority replaced external coercion, turning subjugation into self-mastery. He also manipulated timing with ruthless precision. Ceremonies happened at night, in moments when vigilance was lowest, when nervous systems were most impressionable. Silence before the vow heightened focus. Ritualized gestures anchored memory. Symbolic acts, touch, shared breath, repetition, wired commitment into neural pathways. This is not guesswork. This is applied psychology centuries before it was studied. Every participant learned discipline without realizing it. Courage without needing recognition. Loyalty without reward. Strategy without instruction. That is the dark elegance of the method. It operates invisibly, but its effects are permanent. It cannot be undone by force because it lives in the mind, encoded in identity and memory. And here's the truth you are supposed to feel uneasily. Systems fail not when they are attacked, but when internal authority shifts. A population may obey externally, but if allegiance exists elsewhere, the system has already lost. The priest demonstrated this principle repeatedly. The masters measured compliance with whips and ledgers. He measured compliance with memory and moral obligation. By the time he was gone, his influence had outlasted him. Children carried the lessons. Families retained the bonds. Even when dispersed, the internalized code survived. It was not rebellion in action, it was rebellion in existence. And that is far more difficult to erase. If you have been following, you must recognize the pattern emerging. Control is never absolute. It is fragile where it is assumed to be total. And loyalty can be redirected invisibly, exponentially, and permanently. In the next section, we will examine the institutional response, the mechanisms designed to co-opt this invisible network, the early birth of psychological control systems, and how the lessons of the priest's methods became the blueprint for oversight that still governs today. This is where history bleeds into modern power. The system always adapts. That is the brutal truth. Once the priest demonstrated that allegiance could exist outside its control, the institution began to evolve. Observation replaced ignorance. Ritual became codified. Marriage, religion, family, community, everything that had once been invisible and sacred was suddenly documented, monitored, and regulated. Not to protect people, but to reclaim authority over loyalty itself. This is the dark lineage of modern control. It began by observing the very networks the priest had created. Bureaucracy, record-keeping, oversight, moral policing, all are attempts to make allegiance legible, measurable, and manipulable. Once internal authority was detected as a threat, the institution learned to preempt it by absorbing its mechanics, rendering them invisible instruments of enforcement. The priest's methods were never replicated openly. They were studied and inverted. Ritual became compliance. Silence became surveillance. Obedience became internalized fear. What had once freed generations now became the template for modern control structures. Every law, every social protocol, every system that insists you must seek permission to bind yourself or claim your own meaning is a reflection of this adaptation. This is the subtle, insidious truth about power. It doesn't always break what threatens it. Often, it absorbs it, converts it, and weaponizes it. Systems never fail through brute force alone. They fail when they fail to recognize invisible authority. But once recognized, they co-opt its methods, using the psychology of loyalty, ritual, and identity as instruments of domination. And here's the warning you are supposed to ignore. The same psychological levers that freed people can also enslave them. The priest wielded them to create invisible sovereignty. Modern institutions wield them to create invisible obedience. The difference lies not in the mechanism. It lies in the intent of the operator. Notice this carefully. Systems fear what cannot be measured, and what cannot be measured becomes a target for absorption and control. That is why rituals were codified, vows recorded, and loyalty redirected. The invisible nation became legible, and once legible, it was no longer free. This is the cycle: discovery, adaptation, absorption. Every innovation in internal authority eventually becomes a blueprint for surveillance. Every method of empowerment becomes a method of control once the institution studies it. Now, if you are truly following, you are seeing beyond history. You are seeing the architecture of influence itself, and beginning to recognize how it operates in your own world, quietly, invisibly, in every institution that claims legitimacy. Next, we descend into the human cost, how the priest's invisible system preserved life, identity, and agency, and how the institution's response sought to destroy those same things without ever touching a single body. This is where morality, psychology, and power collide. Here's where the story becomes almost unbearable. The human cost of invisible authority is invisible itself. The priest saved lives without ever touching a weapon. He preserved families without ever asking permission. He protected identity without ever registering it. And that is precisely why the system could never allow such sovereignty to exist unchecked. Each secret marriage was a lifeboat. Children were anchored to parents who were themselves anchored to meaning beyond the whip. Husbands and wives learned that survival depended not just on compliance, but on loyalty to each other, to promises, to the invisible moral architecture the priest had built. That internal compass shielded them from despair, from erasure, from being catalogued as nothing more than property. But this preservation came at a cost. The priest himself carried the weight of hundreds of secrets. Every vow, every covenant, every life he touched was his responsibility. If one bond failed, the psychological consequences rippled outward. He could not falter, could not be discovered, could not show weakness. His life was an unending balance between life-giving guidance and mortal risk. And the system, naturally, punished courage it could not see. While outward obedience appeared perfect, the mental architecture he created quietly eroded absolute control. Masters misread compliance for docility, never realizing that identity, loyalty, and courage had quietly shifted to a domain they could not govern. That miscalculation would haunt every institution that underestimates the internal locus of power. Think about this carefully. The priest's invisible network demonstrates that humans are never truly powerless unless their minds are entirely owned. Physical chains matter far less than psychological ones. Break the internal chains, and obedience becomes negotiable. Break the internal chain of identity, and fear is absolute. He preserved identity. He preserved memory. He preserved choice. That is the true measure of resistance. And the lesson bleeds forward into today. Institutions fear, monitor, and codify every ritual precisely because they know that invisible authority, loyalty, allegiance, internalized hierarchy, is far more dangerous than open revolt. Once someone operates from self-generated power, no whip, law, or ledger can contain them. If you are still listening, you are starting to recognize a pattern. Control is never what it appears to be. Obedience is never what it seems. And allegiance, true allegiance, can exist anywhere, invisible, untouchable, unstoppable, if it is built carefully, deliberately, and internally. The next section descends further, into the priest's methods for encoding courage, loyalty, and identity into minds that the system intended to erase. This is the blueprint for psychological resilience the masters never understood. The priest encoded resilience the way engineers encode circuits. Every ceremony was deliberate. Every repetition reinforced neural patterns. Every symbolic gesture anchored loyalty, courage, and moral independence. He understood that humans internalize meaning through ritual. That is why these marriages were more than vows. They were psychological infrastructure. Kneeling, clasping hands, speaking vows in secret, these were not gestures of tradition. They were vectors of self-sovereignty. A man learned that courage could be cultivated quietly, without recognition. A woman learned that endurance could be disciplined internally, without external reward. Children learned identity, lineage, and responsibility before the law would ever acknowledge it. He also calibrated reinforcement. Repetition strengthened memory. Observation and mentorship taught calculation. Silence emphasized anticipation. Shared risk cemented bonds. The system's methods, fear, coercion, surveillance, were inverted. They were replaced by internalized accountability and loyalty. Every participant became a node in a network the masters could never touch. This is the lesson for anyone listening. True power is invisible, relational, and self-sustaining. It cannot be stolen, legislated, or suppressed. It is built from repetition, meaning, and internalization. The priest weaponized this principle, turning vulnerability into armor, oppression into strategy, and obedience into self-mastery. Notice the subtlety. The priest never needed confrontation. He never needed to fight openly. He did not call armies. He did not incite revolt. He built a psychological ecosystem in which survival, courage, and allegiance thrived, quietly, invisibly, persistently. And that is far more dangerous to any system than open defiance. This is why the system adapted. Fear of external revolt is tangible. Fear of internal sovereignty is existential. Once a population begins to generate allegiance, loyalty, and meaning independently, control collapses quietly. And yet, the institution learned from this lesson, codified it, and weaponized its mechanisms to prevent repetition. If you are still following, you must understand, the priest's methods are blueprint for autonomy, resilience, and invisible power. They reveal the internal architecture of allegiance, the mechanics of obedience, and the pathways to self-sovereignty that no ledger, law, or whip can fully erase. Next, we descend even deeper. We will explore how the priest's invisible network operated like a living system, self-organizing, self-correcting, generational, and how the mechanics of this network became the template for systems of control and influence that still operate today. This is where history, psychology, and power intersect in the shadows. The priest's network functioned like a living organism. Every marriage, every family, every child was a node. Every vow was a connection, every shared secret a link. And like any living system, it self-corrected. Betrayal was managed internally. Weak nodes were reinforced. Strong nodes were cultivated to transmit the network further. The masters never noticed because the system looked static from the outside. But inside, it was dynamic, resilient, and adaptive. He understood feedback loops. When one family faltered under fear, another compensated. When a child forgot a lesson, ritual repetition re-anchored it. Obedience was never forced. It was internally reinforced. Courage was never demanded. It was socially encoded. This is systems thinking applied to human allegiance centuries before it was recognized in theory. And here is the crucial insight. Such a system cannot be destroyed by physical force. Break one family, and 5 more hold the structure. Punish one person, and the network absorbs the loss and adapts. Remove one node, and the psychological map continues. That is why the priest's influence outlasted him. He did not create dependency on a single figure. He created generational infrastructure of meaning. This is the principle modern institutions fear the most. Distributed allegiance is untraceable and uncontainable. Authority cannot be fully grasped if it exists internally rather than externally. The priest weaponized internal authority to create a moral and psychological ecosystem that survived slavery, auctions, and death. Notice the subtle genius. No laws, no documents, no visible rebellion were required. The system believed it controlled behavior because outward compliance existed. Yet the internal order had shifted. People no longer acted solely out of fear. They acted from choice, loyalty, and understanding that their identity feels natural. Look around carefully. Who defines success for you? Who tells you which bonds are real and which are invalid? Who benefits when your loyalty is fragmented, temporary, conditional? The priest knew fragmentation was the enemy of control's enemy. That's why he built permanence in a world designed to be unstable. Today, instability is sold as freedom. Temporary relationships, temporary values, temporary attention. Nothing solid enough to anchor allegiance, except the system itself. This is not accidental. A man without internal hierarchy is endlessly governable. He reacts. He consumes. He complies. Not because he is weak, but because he was never taught how power actually works. The priest taught it without ever naming it. He showed people how to carry authority quietly, without needing validation, without needing permission. And that is the danger. Because once a man realizes that allegiance is portable, that it can be relocated from institutions to internal codes, he stops being predictable. He may still participate. He may still comply tactically, but he is no longer owned psychologically. That is the line institutions cannot tolerate being crossed. This is why the priest story feels heavier the longer you sit with it. It is not inspiring. It is destabilizing. It forces a question that cannot be answered comfortably. Are you loyal by choice, or by design? We are nearing the final layers now. What comes next is not history, not theory, but consequence. What happens to men who reclaim internal authority in systems built to extract it? Reclaiming internal authority comes with a price. It is not celebrated. It is not rewarded. The system resists invisibly. Small pressures appear first, microjudgments, subtle exclusions, quiet skepticism. Then larger pressures follow, barriers to advancement, challenges to legitimacy, subtle forms of sabotage. The world will attempt to reclaim what you think is yours because systems exist to capture allegiance. The priest faced this in its most extreme form. His loyalty to the internal code constantly collided with the plantation's authority. Every act of preservation, every secret vow, every bond he protected was a potential death sentence. Yet he persisted, because internal authority is not a gamble. It is the only form of sovereignty the system cannot negotiate away. This principle applies now. True freedom is always costly. It is rarely acknowledged. It is invisible, quiet, and relentless. To reclaim internal authority is to accept perpetual friction with external structures that demand compliance. You will be tested not with chains, but with obligations, expectations, and moral pressures designed to fragment allegiance. And this is why the priest's method is terrifying, because it is replicable. Internal sovereignty can be taught, networked, and distributed without detection. But once people start exercising it, the surrounding system responds. It adapts. It monitors. It attempts to co-opt. It creates structures designed to make you doubt your internal code. Do not underestimate this. Systems are patient. They outlast individuals. They absorb failures and adjust. That is why understanding the architecture of internal authority is more important than ever. Without it, you are navigating a world designed to extract compliance quietly, invisibly, permanently. The priest succeeded because he understood a truth the masters could never see. Sovereignty begins inside. Identity precedes obedience. Allegiance must be internalized before it can be protected externally. Every ritual, every vow, every repetition was a step toward securing that sovereignty, and every person who participated became part of a resilient, invisible network that no institution could ever fully penetrate. And now, as you sit with this, consider the modern implications. Every hierarchy, every workplace, every institution you participate in is built on the assumption that obedience is external. Internal authority is invisible, and that is where your leverage, your power, and your freedom can exist, if you understand the code. Next, we will descend into the moral and psychological consequences of such power, the burdens, the responsibilities, and the dangers of wielding invisible authority in a world designed to suppress it. Power of this kind is heavy. It is seductive, but it is not freedom without responsibility. The priest carried hundreds of souls in his hands. Every vow, every family, every child depended on his precision, his discretion, his moral clarity. One misstep could destroy not only him, but the fragile ecosystem of trust he built. That is the cost of invisible authority. Vigilance is constant, accountability is internal, and failure is existential. You cannot claim such sovereignty casually. You cannot outsource it. Once you internalize authority, every decision carries weight. Every interaction is a test. The world will attempt to exploit the very freedom you cultivate because systems are designed to see independent thought as a threat. If the priest had relaxed, if he had allowed carelessness, the invisible network would have collapsed under its own exposure. The lesson is brutal. Invisible authority is both power and burden. It cannot be half-owned. It cannot be divided. Either you carry it fully, or it will be co-opted, diluted, and neutralized. The priest succeeded because he understood that the survival of the network depended on absolute precision of thought, absolute fidelity to internal law, and absolute discretion. And the weight of this authority is generational. Every node, every vow, every family carries echoes of that discipline. Once internalized, it propagates. The network becomes self-correcting, resilient, and enduring, but only if each participant honors it. The moment allegiance falters, the system is vulnerable. This is the danger and the beauty of the code. It frees while it constrains. It empowers while it demands accountability. It is invisible, yet absolute. And it teaches a lesson the world will never teach you openly. Freedom without internal discipline is fiction. Allegiance without internal authority is slavery. Now, you must ask yourself a question few ever face. How much of your loyalty is your own, and how much has been silently redirected by structures you cannot see? The priest forced this reckoning on his people through ritual, memory, and repeated engagement. Today, the same principle applies to every institution, every hierarchy, every relationship that claims authority over you. Next, we will explore the mechanism of replication, the way the priest ensured his methods persisted through generations, silently, invisibly, and almost indestructibly, and how understanding this mechanism reveals the secret architecture of enduring power. Replication was the priest's final triumph. He understood that individual allegiance is fragile. Networks endure. One person can be broken, one family sold, one node destroyed. But systems of internal authority, once encoded across multiple nodes, cannot be eliminated. Each secret marriage was not merely a relationship. It was a transmission mechanism, a self-reinforcing loop of loyalty, courage, and identity. He taught participants to mentor others in subtle ways. Not openly, not as instruction, but through modeled behavior, ritual cues, and subtle guidance. Children absorbed posture, tone, and expectation before they understood language. Couples learned strategy, calculation, and moral judgment without explicit teaching. Knowledge propagated invisibly, embedded in behavior, identity, and internalized codes. This is the principle institutions fear most. The replication of internal authority is invisible and exponential. The more nodes, the stronger the network. And because it cannot be recorded or catalogued, the system cannot intervene until it is too late. This is how a few hundred marriages could create resilience that survived slavery, auctions, and dispersion. Notice carefully, replication does not require visibility. In fact, visibility is dangerous. The priest never centralized power. He never made himself indispensable. He distributed responsibility and authority so widely that the network could survive the loss of any single node. That is why systems built on centralization fail. Authority is fragile when concentrated. Authority is durable when internalized, distributed, and repeated. And here's the broader truth. The same mechanism is at work in every institution, every organization, every social structure. Systems seek to monopolize replication. Licenses, degrees, hierarchies, certifications, rituals, all designed to direct allegiance towards sanctioned authority, preventing independent replication. The priest did the opposite. He distributed it invisibly, organically, and irreversibly. If you have been following closely, you can now see the full architecture: disruption of isolation, sacred framing, witness, silence, repetition, internalization, and replication. A system that is invisible, resilient, and self-perpetuating. The masters never understood it because they look for what is visible: obedience, performance, and hierarchy. The priest mastered what is invisible: identity, allegiance, and meaning. Next, we descend into the final consequences: the psychological, moral, and operational implications for anyone who understands this knowledge today. This is where forbidden history merges with the blueprint for modern internal sovereignty. The consequences of mastering internal authority are profound and isolating. The priest lived in constant tension between the world he served and the network he protected. Freedom of mind comes with responsibility. Every decision carries weight. Every action is observed. Every failure echoes. The network survives because of discipline, but that discipline is unrelenting, and mistakes are internalized, not externalized. This is the cost few acknowledge. Internal sovereignty is lonely. The world will not recognize it. Authority exercised invisibly is invisible to others, and often to yourself until you see it clearly. Yet it is the only kind of authority that cannot be co-opted, manipulated, or destroyed. It demands vigilance, clarity, and moral fortitude, qualities the priest honed over decades under the most extreme conditions. And here's the dark elegance: those who operate under this invisible code become almost untouchable. Physical chains, social pressure, bureaucratic control, they all fail against internalized allegiance. Fear loses efficacy. Punishment loses meaning. Obedience becomes selective. The system can still act on bodies, but it cannot penetrate the mind or dismantle meaning. Notice the pattern. The priest's network was not designed to fight external authority. It was designed to make external authority irrelevant. That is the principle modern institutions fear but rarely recognize. Any individual or network that internalizes loyalty, courage, and identity becomes functionally autonomous. They operate within the system yet are never owned by it. And this is where the moral and psychological tension lies. Internal authority grants freedom, but also imposes weight. You are accountable to yourself first. You cannot delegate conscience. You cannot outsource courage. You are always being measured, not by external law, but by internal code. That is the price of independence. Now, as you listen closely, you begin to see the invisible landscape of power. You see how allegiance, loyalty, and identity operate below perception. You see how the priest created networks that survived centuries, and how the system responded by attempting to monopolize every mechanism of internal authority. And you realize, true sovereignty is always dangerous, because it cannot be owned, only respected. Next, we descend into the patterns of modern replication, the echoes of the priest system in contemporary psychological control, elite influence, and organizational design. This is where history becomes operational intelligence for today. The echoes of the priest's invisible network are everywhere, if you know how to look. Modern institutions, corporations, governments, educational systems have adopted the same architecture, inverted to serve control rather than liberation. Ritual, repetition, recognition, certification, and observation are used not to empower, but to internalize obedience and extract allegiance quietly. The code survives, but the intent has been reversed. Notice the mechanism. Humans are taught to value sanctioned approval over internal judgment. Authority is legitimized externally, obedience is incentivized socially, and loyalty is redirected toward structures rather than self. This mirrors every principle the priest used, but instead of freedom, it produces compliance. Internal sovereignty is replaced by external dependence. Identity is outsourced. Meaning is legislated. And here is the insight few dare acknowledge. This is not accidental. It is deliberate. Every ritualized certification, every reward for conformity, every invisible system of social ranking is designed to prevent independent allegiance. Institutions studied the priest, adapted his methods, and inverted them. Knowledge that could liberate became knowledge that confines. But here's the critical takeaway. Understanding the mechanics changes everything. Once you see the code, you can recognize where it is applied, and, more importantly, where it can be redirected. Allegiance is never neutral. Loyalty is never accidental. Identity is never free unless consciously claimed. The priest's network teaches us that even the most oppressive systems can be subverted internally if you understand the architecture. And now, if you are following closely, it is time for action. To internalize this awareness, repeat this symbolic phrase twice in the comments or aloud. I am the witness, not the owned. I am the witness, not the owned. This locks in the shift. It is not ritual for show. It is a micro-encoding of allegiance to yourself, not the system. The next section will show how the priest's principles, when understood and applied today, offer a blueprint for invisible influence, resilience, and sovereignty in the modern world, a map for reclaiming internal authority in an age designed to extract it. This is where forbidden knowledge becomes operational power.